The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, is the first in the epic trilogy based off J.R.R. Tolkien's novel. And, it's always a huge task taking on a book and adapting it to screen. And I'd say most of the time it fails because, a lot of fans already have their ideas in the head and what they've constructed in their own imagination of what they want stuff to be like. So it's a huge amount of pressure on the filmmaker to really nail adaptations and really represent what people want to see. But I have to say, this trilogy of films almost achieves the impossible as it totally nails the translation from book to film. And I think this had a huge amount of interest in it and sort of wariness to it because it had decades of fans building on it. It came out years after the book had been released. It's not like something where it was still ongoing, almost like Harry Potter. This had a huge fan base already built, and it does such a good job of reconstructing the world in a visual medium. And I think most fans were very pleased with how it turned out. So the film starts and we get probably one of the greatest openings in film ever. Exposition is always a bit of a hard thing to tackle because you've got to tell quite a lot of information and not make it seem boring. You look at films like Star Wars and they have the title crawl, which has sort of become iconic. And then, this film, if you're going to do exposition, this is how you do it. We get this great sequence of narration and it essentially tells us the setup for the story, but we get to see it visually as well. You get to see just the epic scale of this film on full show. From the first 5 minutes, you'll want to watch the rest of this film. It really does pull you in, and it doesn't half-heartedly show you bits and pieces. And you'd think this would be the best you get to see, but the whole film is the quality of the opening. So we start and we see the battle with Sauron, the main villain of the trilogy. And, it really drives home the point of, how dangerous he is just in a few sort of seconds of seeing him. He's killing dozens of men in single hits. So you really do get that sense of danger, but you also learn about essentially the main point of the film, which is the ring. And you get a sense of it's almost alive in a weird way. And, sort of remember that going into the film as well. And I think once you look at it like that, it's not so much an object as it is kind of a character on its own. And it does such a good job of introducing it. We then go to the Shire, which I think is great because it's sort of like we've just seen this epic battle and then we cut to sort of normality and calmness. And it sort of shows the contrast in the world, which I think is really great because, worlds do contrast, they're not all the same. So we get to see the Shire, which is designed perfectly. You can almost smell what it'd smell like and feel what it'd feel like to be there. It feels very homely and it's very with nature and it just looks amazing. We're introduced to Frodo, sort of the lead protagonist and hero of the story. And I have to say, when I watched these films when I was a bit younger, I wasn't a huge fan of Frodo. I found him quite an annoying hero because I think as a kid, your idea of hero is someone more similar to sort of Aragorn who comes into the story. But I have to say, rewatching him when I'm a bit older, I like him a lot more because he is the hero in spite of not being, a great warrior or, very strong or, he's not very skilled, but he's a hero for his willpower. And I think that's such a great message. It's sort of like the general person can have a major impact on events. You can definitely see sort of the World War inspiration there, where it was the general people who had to fight. And, I do very much like that on rewatch. And I think sort of a lot of people don't like Frodo, but I think if you look at it sort of like that, you'll definitely change your mind. I've always found it funny though, how in this one film he gets stabbed twice. It's just, I don't know why I find that so odd. I find it just funny that he's been stabbed in a matter of an hour. Elijah Wood does quite a good performance as well. I think he just grows more and more into the role as the films go on as well. But, he starts off pretty good as well. And you can really see that sort of innocent and naiveness to him, especially at the start of this film. And even by the end of this film, you can see a massive growth in character. This film more so focuses on responsibility and sort of Frodo taking on his duty. And the next two films sort of focus on the sort of the weight of that. But it's so great, just this film by itself on sort of the story it tells with him. We're then introduced to Ian McKellen as Gandalf, and, that's probably perfect casting. He's probably the go-to sort of wizard image, when you think of it. I can't imagine anyone else playing the role, and I think he did it so well. I think the costume is amazing for Gandalf the Grey. It feels so magical in a world that already feels quite, fantasy-like. He does stand out, and I've always quite liked that. But just on them two characters, we get to see the amazing work on sort of perspective at this point as well, where they've tried to make the hobbits look, shorter and Gandalf look like a regular sized human. And it's honestly incredible. The effects and like how they've done it, sort of the engineering of sets and props to sort of make it work so it looks like these different scales is absolutely spotless. And it still holds up amazing today. And you'd think it'd look janky in a few places, but there's not a single point in the film where I was like taken out of it because it hadn't been done well. And the amount of effort behind the scenes that went into that, it really makes you appreciate that because they've done stuff like different sizes of the sets and stuff to show the different scales of the characters, and you just think how much work's gone into this film. They have really put a lot of care into it, and you can definitely see that, whereas a lot of films feel very produced. This one, it was made for a reason. We're also introduced to Bilbo. He only has sort of a small role in these films, but essentially in these films he sort of acts as what the ring can do, even to people who are good at heart like Bilbo is. Like, you get to see more of him in the Hobbit trilogy, but you get to see sort of how it affects people, and it's quite sad really. There's also 3 other hobbits that are part of sort of the journey that get onto it, and it's Sam, who's sort of Frodo's best friend, and we've got Merry and Pippin as well, and they're sort of friends with all them, and they end up going on the journey together. But I have to say, there is a bit of a change from the book, I believe, where it's Frodo's much older in the book. He's more middle-aged, but to be honest, I kind of prefer them going down the angle where, it never says his age in this film, but it implies those sort of 4 hobbits are all sort of a similar age and they're quite young. I think it plays more on that sort of naive aspect and, that sense of wanting to go into adventure and not really knowing the cost of that. I prefer that personally, where they are all the same age. I think it is something different, especially when you've had the Hobbit, which is a middle-aged sort of Hobbit person. So to have a younger one, I think is a bit better. But, that's just sort of my opinion. The filmmakers went with that, and I don't think too many people had a problem with it, which I think shows that people quite like that subtle change. It's not huge. There is also a change of like how long Frodo has the ring before he goes on his adventure, it seems. Again, it never states it, but I'm pretty sure in the book he has it for like quite a while, just whilst he's in the Shire. Whereas in the film, it seems like it's only been maybe a few weeks or a month at max, and I kind of prefer that. It didn't, to me, that jump wouldn't have added anything. I think it's better to just, sort of crack on with the story, and I like how it sort of shortens that length of time instead of having another time jump after we've just had sort of the introduction, which was like 3,000 years ago. So Frodo sets off on his quest, to destroy the ring, and he's accompanied by Sam, and he's promised Gandalf he'll always look after Frodo, which I love that sort of little interaction because it comes up, quite a lot, especially at the end of this film, which I like. And Gandalf said he'll meet them both at the Prancing Pony Inn at Bree. So Gandalf goes off to meet Saruman, who's another wizard. And again, another amazing casting. We get Christopher Lee as, this other wizard. And he's sort of the bad one. It's revealed he's working with Sauron, the main villain. I know that's a bit confusing, Saruman and Sauron. But yeah, so you find out he's working with him, and you get this fight between them. And it always disappointed me how we never sort of get a rematch between them. I know that's probably quite a small issue, and that's more the other films, but just to bring that up here. But we get that fight, so Gandalf's captured, and, Frodo and Sam then bump into Merry and Pippin, so they get sort of strung on the journey, and then we're introduced to the Nazgul, which are like these Grim Reaper-looking horse-riding sort of hunters. And they have a lot of mystery around them, and, the sound effects for them, they have this sort of scream they use a lot. And it's just great. They do really invoke the idea of terror, sort of this unstoppableness, especially to our characters, because they are just hobbits, especially as the like younger ones as well. They have sort of no experience, and you feel like that in the scene. It really does change from this sort of hopeful, adventurous attitude they had sort of in the Shire onwards, and now we're getting those sort of dark tones coming in. So they manage to escape, and they get to the sort of inn. And I like the moment like Gandalf's not there, they kind of panic. It doesn't go to plan. I quite like that. I always like that in stories where, plans don't work, because in real life they don't a lot of the time, and they don't really have a backup. I like how it sort of shows how unprepared they are for this journey, and, they are going to learn how dangerous this could be potentially later on. But I love how this is sort of hinting to that, and they are very much scared. We're then introduced to Aragorn, who's the human character, and he's more sort of the typical hero archetype, whereas like Frodo is slightly not. But just because he is, he's still very interesting. You know, he's quite a mysterious figure at first, but you know they have no one and they sort of panicking, so they just trust him. And, you know, he explains that the Nazgul are ring wraiths, which basically means they work for Sauron and they're hunting after the ring. And I love the great detail of that. They are the 9 kings that accepted the rings that you see in the intro. You know, it's such cool stuff, and that's credit to the story, obviously, not the film. It adds this sort of very horrific element where we've seen them as humans in the beginning, and now they're just sort of these monster type beings, and it really does show who the villain they're sort of dealing with is, like what he can turn people into becoming. So we get this sort of fight on this rundown sort of fortressy looking castle thing. And you know, that's great as well, you know, it has such a good atmosphere and it looks so real. You know, it looks, you know, it's a proper set, and with the mist and everything, it just does such a good job of, you know, shifting the tone to like, this is serious now, like I explained. And even more so, you know, our hero gets stabbed and he doesn't just bounce back like you'd expect. He's quite realistic and he's actually injured from it. But then he's saved by an elf Arwen, and, you know, just from the little interaction, you can tell that Aragorn knows her. And it's little stuff like that shows like how professional this film is. You know, every line has importance, whereas, you know, sort of like a less thought out film would have to explain to you 50 different ways how they know each other. But it's just from one single interaction, you can tell there's history between them, and there is that sense of trust. So Frodo's saved by Arwen with, you know, we get a good sequence with horses where she's being chased by the Ringwraiths. And, you know, then we arrive at Rivendell, which is this elven sort of kingdom. And, you know, it's so good because you get this contrast from what we've already seen. You know, we've seen the Shire and it's very, you know, countryside, English countryside type area. And, you know, then we get Bree, which is sort of like this muddy, horrible, rainy, also kind of like England area. But then we get Rivendell and, you know, everything looks, you know, warm and soft, and I love how everything looks sort of glowy. You know, it adds to that mystical element, and you do feel that these are very like elegant people. And you know, the design of the place is so well done. It really does represent the race of elves in this world. And here we meet a lot of other characters. We meet Elrond, who was shown in the beginning, and, you know, he's the father of Arwen, who we were just introduced to. So a bit of a dynamic there. And we find out that Aragorn and Arwen, you know, sort of wanted to get together, but with her being immortal and him being mortal, you know, it's a bit of a complication there. And, you know, that's great. You know, it's Aragorn sort of, you know, it adds a bit of character to Aragorn there, where he's been quite mysterious up until this point. We're also introduced to the rest of the Fellowship of the Ring, which is Boromir, Legolas, and Gimli. And, you know, Gimli and Legolas more shine in the next 2 films. They're more just sort of there as group members in this one. Especially Legolas, like Gimli gets a bit of a moment later on with Moria where it builds up some of his character. But Boromir is definitely probably the most characterised in this one. And that's because he kind of dies. So Boromir is definitely the most characterised out of the characters that come in here. And he's kind of like the opposite Aragorn. You know, he very much wants to use the ring as a weapon. And, you know, he's sort of blind to its temptation. You know, it's trying to get him to think that way on purpose. And it goes more into that later on. And he's sort of a representation of what could happen to anyone, you know, with being around the ring long enough. So our heroes sort of set out. And, you know, we get some great landscape shots of New Zealand where they filmed it. And it's honestly breathtaking, you know, because they're actually there. You can tell they're actually there. You know, this isn't some studio. They are properly in these amazing looking locations. And you also get that sense of they are travelling, and they've been travelling quite a while now. We then get to a part where it's sort of this avalanche going on, and Frodo decides they should go through Moria, which Gimli keeps suggesting. And I honestly think the Moria sequence is amazing. You know, when we get there, it's got this sort of already quite dark tone because it's, you know, it's caves and stuff like that. But, you know, Gimli is confident in it. You know, dwarves live in caves, so it's not that weird. But there is that hint of unsettlingness. We get in there, and there is this build up in this scene of this creature in the water, and when there's the reveal of it, and it's this sort of horrible octopus looking thing. It's great. It's such a good build up, and then our heroes are sort of stuck in there. And then Gandalf mentions how it's like a 4-day journey, and you start to think, well, maybe was this such a good idea? I think that's sort of good because they kind of stuck with this idea now. They can't turn back. Then we get our sort of mention of Gollum I haven't talked about yet, because he isn't a present character in this film much. You sort of see a glimpse of him in this here, and Gandalf sort of explains it's this person who was in possession of the ring, and it very much affected them in a horrible way, and they sort of like addicted to it, and they become kind of a monster. And I'll talk more about that when I review the other two films. But then we get the scene of them entering sort of the tomb of Balin, and it's such a good setup this because it gives off such a feel of unease when they just enter that room and there's bodies all over the place, and we get a great little bit where Gandalf's reading the book, and it really builds up that sense of dread when the book ends and it's sort of been hastily wrought. And then we get Pippin making the noise, and we get this sequence of orcs attacking, and we haven't seen really orcs other than the beginning at this point. And it's so good, and we get the cave troll as well. I'd say that's probably maybe the only bit of dated CGI. It looks a bit out, a bit janky, but honestly, it's such a minor thing. It looks completely fine because they have put the effort into everything else. The set, the makeup, the orcs look great. The design of the creatures in this film is honestly amazing. And then we get Frodo getting stabbed again, but luckily he's been gifted this mithril vest by Bilbo a bit earlier on in Rivendell, so he's completely fine. And that already sort of shows how Frodo's got a bit smarter. Well, maybe not so much, but you get what I mean compared to how he got stabbed in the beginning and he was unprepared. And you also get the hobbits actually fighting at this point. It's already showing that bravery start to come out. And yeah, that whole sequence, the action's great. You really get to see everyone, do the thing. We then get a moment where they're all sort of running through the large hallway. And honestly, the architecture and the design of the Dwarven Kingdom's amazing. It perfectly contrasts the elves of, part of nature and very glowy and flowing and very smooth. And the dwarves is very, sharp-edged, chiseled out of stone and dark. Again, it really expresses what that race represents and shows the contrast between the two. And almost, you can see sort of why they don't get along just looking at where they live. It's such a good visual metaphor almost. And we get this great sort of imagery of all these orcs springing out of everywhere. And there's a great shot of where they're coming out sort of the roof like spiders and they're crawling down the sides. And it's honestly amazing because, it's like the place is flooding with orcs, and, you get the sense our characters are going to drown. There's no way they're making it out of this because there's just like hundreds of these things around. And then we get this moment where, there's this roar and they all run off. As an audience member, you're like, well, what is possibly worse than the situation they were just in? And you see that sort of Gandalf's worried as well, and it builds up that dread, and you think to the, what was earlier within the book where it was this demon and fire thing, that image in the book, and you get to see it, and you get to see the Balrog. And honestly, again, the design is amazing. It's like this devil-like creature, and it really gives a sense of evil off. It rolls like a furnace. And we obviously get the iconic moment with Gandalf, and then we get sort of Gandalf dying. But to Frodo, he pretty much does. Frodo and Sam never see him again, do they, until sort of the end of the journey. And again, that reinforces to Frodo how real this is, I think. And, to the rest of the group, they've lost a member now. But, they still have to continue, because if they stop, it'd mean he died for nothing. And I just love that. This film is essentially the point of showing, the idea of adventure is fun, but it does have consequences. And, and it maybe isn't as fun as you initially expected. And then we get to see another sort of Elven Kingdom with Galadriel. And we get this sort of great little bit where Frodo sees the future. And, it sort of, I think, reminds Frodo why this is so important. Whereas I think he kind of wants out at this point. Even he's seeing all the horrible stuff, that has happened and could happen to the rest of the group. And I think he just wants to be done with it. He doesn't want the pressure anymore. But, he sees what could happen if he doesn't do it. And I love that little bit. It sort of spurs him on. we then move on to sort of the final part where we see sort of these amazing statues of kings. Again, really good world building and just, design. It's honestly amazing how well they've done. And we get this moment between Frodo and Boromir where Boromir, up until this point, there'd been slight moments where, the ring is clearly getting to him, he wants it. And Boromir is a great example to us as the audience. He's essentially a visual example of how the ring is so dangerous. We kind of saw it with Isildur in the past, but to see it sort of live helps us get a much better understanding. And Boromir's not evil or anything, but you can see how it's sort of driving him mad almost. And when he attacks Frodo, it just shows how powerful the ring can be on people that could be easily tempted by it. And like, even when you look at it, Boromir's motives are technically, for good because he wants to use it to destroy evil. But I think that's the great metaphor of it. You can't use evil to destroy evil. And it's sort of showing how in that process he is becoming evil. Do you get what I mean? But yeah, it's honestly great. And when he realises what he's done, it's quite a sad moment, especially with what's coming next. Because he does get a chance to redeem himself, but it's sort of sad that he does die. I mean, obviously it's expected, it's Sean Bean. But, it's really great storytelling. It clearly shows the consequences stuff like this can have. We get this moment between Aragorn and Frodo, where it clearly shows how the type of man he is compared to Boromir, whereas Boromir sees what they can do with it. He's kind of ignoring the evil implications of the ring. Aragorn knows he could fall to its temptation, and he knows Frodo needs to be the one to do it because Frodo's trying to sort of pass off the burden. Frodo's done almost. He is very much struggling with, having this responsibility. But I think Aragorn's belief in him, again, spurs him on some more. But it also shows us how, Aragorn as a character, he is resisting that temptation, but he has the hindsight to know he wouldn't be able to do that forever. Some great stuff there. But yeah, on to sort of the fight with all the Uruk-hai turning up. Pretty good stuff. The later stuff in the next two films, their sort of big finales, really do hit it out the park. But this is a much smaller scale finale. I'd say the big sort of action set piece of this film is definitely Moria. And this is more of an emotional ending. You get what I mean? So we get a great fight, again, getting to see everyone use their skills and abilities. And we get this great shot at one part where the camera is following all the Uruk-hai sort of running. And it's this amazing long take through the woods that I have no idea how they achieved. But it honestly looks great because, drones were a thing then. Again, showing, the effort and sort of love that went into this film. And then we get to see Boromir, fighting off Uruk-hai, protecting Merry and Pippin, and he's getting shot. And then Aragorn saves him, and we get into this sort of quick 1v1 with Aragorn and this Uruk-hai. And it's honestly a great fight. It's very brutal. The 1v1 aspect is pretty good. It helps it feel more personal, especially the fact that this one's just killed Boromir. Well, mortally wounded him. And, it's got the bit with the shield trapping Aragorn's head, and it's honestly great, and he deflects that real dagger. That's pretty mad when you look into that. But yeah, I love how brutal it is when he chops its arm off and then its head. And then we get this great moment of, Boromir sort of saying, sort of apologising in a way to Aragorn. And, it's really powerful because it does show Boromir was never evil. It just shows the ring's influences. And like I said, it is really sad, but I think it is great storytelling because it does show those consequences, and that people aren't safe in this story. So Merry and Pippin get captured, and that's continued in the next film. And we've got Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli going after them. And we have Frodo and Sam. And, we get this moment where Frodo's trying to do it alone because he doesn't want anyone else to get hurt. But Sam, he's loyal to a fault, and, I love the bit that he's willing to risk his life to just even be, follow Frodo. It's such a good moment, and it shows the bond between the two that only does grow throughout the film. And it's honestly some of the best stuff in the trilogy, I think, Frodo and Sam. I think that is the main point of the story, those two characters. And they really do shine in the next few films just as a duo. But yeah, we finally get Frodo accepting the responsibility, and he does know it's not going to be easy, but he knows he needs to do it. And I think that's so good at the end. He's finally accepted what this adventure really is, and it is a quest to defeat evil. And with that, he will see horrific things, but he's got to, he's got to keep persevering. I just want to mention the soundtrack in this film. Honestly, absolutely amazing. I think it is some of the most iconic music going. It evokes such a feeling of the locations it's paired with. The Shire, it's very jolly and, innocent. And it perfectly reflects that entire place and sort of reflects Frodo and the rest of the hobbits at the beginning of the journey. But, we also have the Rings theme, which is sort of, I guess, the main theme of Lord of the Rings. And it is this, you get that sense of it tempting you, and it is that got that sinister undertone that really sort of like it's calling out to you, and it's great. It evokes that sense of dread. And again, Mordor, I hadn't even spoke about, the design of Mordor, top notch. And again, the music to go with it feels evil. It really does excel. It already improves the amazing visuals. And, again, the soundtrack for the elves is very light and, calm, just like the setting and just like the elves themselves. But yeah, all the soundtrack is honestly amazing. And, there's not too many new pieces going forward in the trilogy. A lot of the stuff in this film is reused. There's some few new pieces, but I don't care. This soundtrack is honestly amazing and one of the best in cinema. Overall, this film is great. I think it is the pinnacle of sort of fantasy films. It really captures the world so well. Fantasy, it could very easily become silly, but it keeps that sort of serious tone, and it keeps that, I know this sounds a bit weird, but grounded tone in its own world. And it is just amazing. The effects still hold up to this day, and it is because it uses such a wide variety, to create the best visuals possible. And, you can really tell with this film a lot of love and, attention has gone into it. Someone's heart has really gone into this. Peter Jackson has done an amazing job adapting, the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. And I think that's the reason fans were so happy, because he made them, I think the best way you could. I honestly think this film is a perfect adaptation of the first part of the book. So, yeah, I have to say, score-wise, I think this film is an easy 10 out of 10. It has no real problems. It does a great job of introducing you to the world and the story and the characters. And it only leaves you looking forward to the next installment. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. See ya.